Thank you. Thank you. All right, guys. Hi, I'm John Renner. I'm going to give a talk on AngularJS, if that wasn't obvious at this point. What AngularJS is a web framework created by Google to solve the problem that web applications are not what web browsers are good at. So to preface this talk, I have some expectations from you. I'll expect that you know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on a basic level, that you know how to build a page, how JavaScript fits into there, and that CSS is used to style. Honestly, the CSS we won't hardly touch at all. It's just there. It'll be there. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about why you would ever want to use Angular. We're going to talk about kind of how it works, and then we're going to give a run through a tech demo of how it works. If you want to follow along in the tech demo, sorry the color got to get messed up. It's we just need to install Node.js and Git. We'll be using them if you want to follow along. All right, so this whole problem that AngularJS solves is relatively new. It's the fact that back in the day, we were fine with web pages. Pages were great. Pages were like Wikipedia. Pages were like your blog. It's great. They didn't do anything, but they just displayed content. But then we realized that JavaScript is the runtime of the world. It works everywhere. All of a sudden, you get things like Google Music getting built, things that are huge, huge amounts of stuff happening on the client side. And you look at the way HTML is structured, and it doesn't work for that. There's no sort of templating system. There's no sort of navigation aside from loading up a new URL. That's actually changed recently in HTML, and there's now a thing called push state, where we can actually trick the browser into thinking it's hit a new page. It's still a little hacky, but it works, and Angular actually does work alongside it. So without a web page, we need a way to make web apps. And we're really good at making apps. We have good frameworks and stuff in iOS and Android. We've learned pretty much how we want to run apps. But the browser doesn't mirror that. So AngularJS was created to create that app environment in the browser. Google refers to, actually not Google, the team refers to it as Superheroic MVW. You'll see in the documents that it's MVC a lot, but it also says MVW. They're a bit confused as to what they actually want to say. The W stands for Model View Whatever, or whatever works for you, which is interesting because there's actually a controller component and not a model component, so go figure. All right, so AngularJS, I've summed down to 5 angles because it's Angular. It's very clever. We have the 3 that are just pure business logic, which are services, controllers, and filters. These could be tested without a DOM. In other words, without a web browser, you could run these and test them, and they would all work. Now, directives are sort of the bridge between your application logic and the DOM. What they let you do essentially is specify new HTML elements and new attributes on existing elements to allow them to have extra capabilities. So these require the DOM to test, and that shows up in the way you test them. Templates do not exist anywhere alongside any of these, except that they're used by them. They're not referenced in the modules and the logic. They're just there. So they're sort of apart. So if we hear, this would be the DOM definition, and this is the module line, actually. These are the module. These are outside. So modules are the primary agent of dependency in Node. Angular. So Angular does a lot with dependencies, as any good application architecture would. It also uses a concept called injection, dependency injection, which is the idea that I declare by name the dependency I want, rather than by actual referencing the object. What this does is, when I want to test, I can replace that name. I can say this name now refers to my mockup of that name, and that helps testing a lot. You don't have to modify any of your code. And all functionality goes into modules. Absolutely everything that's going to happen in your application goes into module. Now notice that just functionality, not display. Displays doesn't go in there. Keep it out. All right, services are the business logic. They are singletons that can be either functions or objects, and they provide a certain set of functionality. Now, the interesting thing about services is they're not models. Normally, your primary source of business logic is a model. It references some kind of data type, and it's very object-oriented in that sort of way. Services are usually a set of functions or one specific function, or a set of data. What that means is your models actually exist abstracted behind the service if you want to have them, which is what's strange about, again, the whole MVW, MVC. The model stays, but models aren't really part of Angular. There are singletons. This is important as well in that when you reference them again and again, you're always getting the same thing. which means that you need to handle that properly. You don't expect new instances, except for when you do expect new instances, which we'll get to. They can be declared in 3 different fashions: as services, factories, and with service, with factory, and with provider. So working them down, service is the most basic. Service says anytime I reference it, I actually want a new version of this service, like a new object. Versus factory, which says, all right, we have one function we'll use to produce it, and we'll return a value, and that's what you'll get every time. We produce it once and stamp it around. And providers are like absolutely everything you can possibly imagine. It's basically a factory function for a function that it contains in its return value a getter for a service. It's really helpful. It's the full declaration, and it makes a lot of sense when I'm not describing it. All right, controllers are not really controllers either. They're not what you would think of typically. They control the scope. That's what that says. It's in red. It's hard to read. What the scope is basically all the values that you can access inside of a template. And the controller essentially will interact with the services and modify the values in the scope. Controllers are also singletons? That shouldn't be there. That was from the last slide. Controllers are attached to a template. They essentially sit over the template, and inside that template, the scope can be used. Every template with every template controller pairing gets a new scope unless you manually change that. Filters are really easy. They're legitimately just a way of formatting data for presentation. This is template syntax for inserting the value title run through the filter uppercase. So all that would do is just display title in uppercase there, whatever title was. Directives are complicated. This is a simple one built into Angular. It's the ng model. What that does basically is it ties to scope.user, and anytime the value of input changes, like as I type, the value of scope.user will change dynamically, constantly. That's a really, really helpful one, and it's built for us. We can add more if we want to, and we will. Not today, though, because they're a lot of work. They can be both attributes or elements, or both. Most of the built-in Angular ones could be both. This one is specifically an attribute. All right, templates are basically Angular's HTML. It's all valid HTML until you use that double curly brace that we saw earlier. Templates are compiled once and continually linked. What that means is we compile the template, and Angular basically says, okay, I understand this. I understand where the values go. I understand what happens when I insert values. And then you continuously pump values into them, and they change. So that means, for example, if I was using ngModel, I could have ngModel referencing a value, and then have that value displayed elsewhere, and as I typed, it would change elsewhere. It's continually linked. Now, one of the big advantages of Angular, like Google's huge about it, is testing. Testing client-side apps is nigh on impossible, because there's just so much that can go wrong and there's no structure. Angular provides a structure and therefore makes it easy to, they provide a testing structure alongside of it. The testing works via a node server and a page that you load up in the browser. So what that means is your testing is actually done in the browser that you want to test on. So it's actually really convenient. I can open up the testing in Firefox and Chrome, and as I'm editing, it'll keep testing it. It's really nice. We're not going to cover that today because it's a lot to cover. Yes?
Does that mean Angular has its own testing?
It does. It uses Karma. It's a Java. It's that thing. It's the bridge between Node and the client for testing, and it has a constant updating thing, which is the end-to-end part. All right, so I know I kind of just threw a ton of information at you, and I swear it's going to make a lot more sense because now we're going to actually use it. Now, I don't need to do that on my Mac. All right, so if you want to grab the Git repo we're going to be using, I want that somewhere else. I just want a new. You're coming with me. Well, that's just awkward. Hello, guys. All right. So, is that readable? Somewhat? OK. Well, it'll work. All right. So, the Git repo that this is at is https://github.com/jmrenner. I should have had a slide for this. I'm sorry. /GithUB-feed. I'll clone it, and it's down. So what we're going to build today is we're going to build a feed reader for GitHub. It's going to show us the activity of what's going on inside it. I can show you what it'll look like. We need to get into it first. This is the setup stage. I'm just doing npm install so I can get all my dependencies I need for the Node server to run. Angular starts statically, but I'm using Node to run a basic static server for it. All right, so if we run node scripts/server, I need a new window here. All right, so if we go to localhost :3000, see this, and we enter a GitHub credential, and we'll get a list of everything that's going on GitHub. It's kind of cool and pretty basic. So we're going to start. If you pull down the Git repo, it's at its finished state, which is obviously not that helpful for most of you. So we can do a git checkout stage 0, which will get us back to the stage 1. That's awkward. Do tags not push?
Tags.
Oh,
Tags.
thank you. Fetch?
Or fetch.
Okay, sorry. I've set up the tags so that we can follow, so you can follow along. If you get,
Push the tags.
I did push, probably not. All right, so we're just going to go back to the very beginning of the repo. This is awkward. Git log. All right, we're jumping back. I'm sorry about this, guys. All right. Git checkout. All right. So if we open this up, you can see what we have, just that it's a base project. Not RDO. Where the hell am I?
I have so many desktops.
The more the merrier. All right, new. Screw it, I'm taking this one with me. Okay, so we're going to open that file. I don't even know. I'm not on my own computer today, guys. I'm sorry, I'm a bit off. Does this will work? Awesome. So, /. All right, here we go. So, README, this is what we're doing. We're going to build an example JS app, and sitting there in app is just some basic empty stuff with a simple index HTML. All well and good. Now let's just sort of pump in a bit of content to show us what we want. Again, these would be a little faster otherwise, but input. Nah. Okay, so what we're going to build right now is we're going to build that top of the page where we insert the username and password. So you know what? I'm just going to check out the next revision where I have that. Okay, check out the next commit. Any ideas, guys? It's right there.
Have the hash right there. You could just do 7b6. 7b6.
All right. Reload. All right. Look at that. We set up a static version of the site. All it is we'll load it up. It's right. I am godly. All right. So the server's up and running. Why is it doing that? Give me my. I did close it, didn't I? All right. So if we go to localhost, we're now dealing with a static page. Look at that. There's nothing there. It doesn't do anything. It just sits there. Actually, if I press that, it'll refresh. All right. So the next step that we need to do is we need to link in Angular. So Angular links in just like any other JavaScript, but with an important distinction in that you put it at the end of your body. This is important because load times. Basically, if you put the script in the head, it won't start loading the body often until the script is loaded, or we'll do other nasty things. Basically, you want to put it down here so the whole content is rendered, and then you start with your Angular stuff. So to get Angular, which is an important step, we're going to go to angularjs.org and grab the latest version and click the download button. We're going to deal with unstable, as Angular is just about to reach the 1.2 release. It's not really that unstable anymore. And it's going to be more helpful to use the up-to-date one. So we'll chuck that in, and we're going to actually get rid of the .min.js and get the actual one. This is much helpful for testing because as opposed to production, you want more verbose things. So we get more verbose errors if we're not using the minified version. This will save us a lot of time. Trust me, the errors are unrecognizable otherwise. All right. Now, there's another resource we're going to want, comes with Angular, called AngularRoute. It's built by the same people. It's right here. AngularRoute is going to be used for routing in our application. So, for example, page loads. Rather than going to the server, we'll use AngularRoute, and it'll handle all of that. Yeah. Fancy, guys. All right. So, now that we have those two set up, we're going to hop into our app.js and declare a module. This module is going to be my app because we are so happy about our app. There are no dependencies. What go into that bracket right there would be module dependencies. We have none yet. We haven't written any modules. Actually, I lied. We're going to depend on ngRoute. All right, so the config module is run on the instantiation, the config function is run on the instantiation of the module. So if we want to access the route provider, which we do to set up our page, we need to actually inject it. So the way you inject is any function in Angular, anything that accepts a function like this, is we're actually just set up a list instead, or an array, and any argument that isn't a function is a dependency. So we want route provider. And then we can accept route provider in the function. Again, this lets us later, if we were testing, to mock up route provider if we wanted to. It's very, very handy. So now we say route provider.when/, so we're declaring a page now. So we have a controller, which is nothing. And we have a template, which we're going to set up, which will be in, we're going to rename my module to GitHub Feeds. And then, so the template URL will be in /GitHub Feeds /templates. There's a folder structure in here that you can see. And we'll say /index.html. So what I've just set up is ngRoute will look at the page and say, okay, are we at root? If so, we're going to load up this template. It'll dynamically grab it for us. And we're going to give it this controller function to handle it. That's all well and good, nice and easy. And we're just going to put one extra rule in here, route provider.otherwise /. What that means is if it hits a route it doesn't know how to handle, it takes us right back to root, which is helpful. All right, so we're going to go into template and create a new file. It's index.html. And we're going to take all of this junk out of here and chuck it into index.html. So right now we're just going to be using Angular to render the template without any controller, anything fancy. Now, the last thing, a couple more things we have to do actually. We have to link the script for our module. So our module is located in source/app.js. Whoa. There we go. Okay. So app.js, yay. So now, the last thing you have to do now is Angular needs to bootstrap around something. So that's their term. So what you need to do is you need to declare an ng-app, which is on our HTML because we don't have multiple apps running on one web page. So our ng-app is up here, and we called it my app because we are so proud of our app. Now, assuming I did this right, which I'm saying I didn't, it should render. It did not. So we open the Chrome DevTools and we find out that's the downloads. That's Gmail. All right. Mac keyboard shortcuts are insane. All right. tools, develop JavaScript console. All right. So we ran into an error. It failed to instantiate my app due to cannot use in operator to search for 0 in slash. Huh. So clearly I typed something wrong, and I don't want to exactly find out what it is, because this is an error that I've hit all day and has just magically gone away from me. So what it's actually trying to do is NGRoute is looking for something and not finding it. It's looking for a route, and it's somehow interpreted something wrong. And I'm not entirely sure what it is, and I'm not entirely sure what the error is. So I fixed it in the past by just basically rewriting top to bottom. So NGRoute has terrible errors, and I would not recommend using it most of the time. But we're using it because Angular uses it in their demonstrations, so you want to be able to understand what's going on in any other website. So if we check out the next version, I can show you probably what the issue was. All right. So again, you see what we had before. This is not here. Ignore that. Okay. So if we have the website up again, look at that. The website's off. We're running the node server now. All right. So it's all static now. It's exactly the way it was before. Now, there's a bit of a difference in the way I was doing it here, in that, so I have my app routing. Now, it was otherwise I was throwing an error, I guess. So I'm referencing GitHub feed, which is the actual module. So the way I have organized this is that we have high-level modules and an app. So the app is only going to be doing routing. And this is good, because you want to use module dependencies for everything. So GitHub feed is our real module where all of our functionality is. It's referencing a controller, which is nothing. All well and good. We've declared a controller in here. It does nothing. So what we want to do now is we want to start to get some more dynamicness going on here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into template. And as we saw before, we had multiple of these panels that had user information on them. So we're going to use a directive that's built into Angular called ngrepeat. ngrepeat basically lets us repeat for every element in an array. So we're going to repeat for event in events. Now you'll say, where is events? It's nowhere. So we're going to put it in controller, the controller that we have assigned. And we're going to say scope dot events is equal to nothing. It's an empty array. So if we reload the page, in theory, we should see absolutely nothing here. And we did. But now if I were to fill this with elements, we're not referencing the elements or doing anything with them. But we're just displaying the same content for each element in there. I did not save that, I don't think. I hope I didn't. Oh, I didn't reference scope. We have to inject scope into the function. Same way we did before. We just create an array, and then the dependencies go first, and then they get injected into the function. Angular's inject service handles that for us. So much of the underpinnings of Angular is actually written in Angular. It's very interesting. All right. So now we have content loading that has absolutely nothing to do with the data that we're trying to put into it, but we're rendering it for an array. So let's now try to say, okay, now we want to talk to GitHub. We want to start pulling data down. So we're going to declare a service. So we're going to go and create a new file, and we're going to call it GitHub API.js. All right, now GitHub API we'll declare as an Angular module. I'm using modules a lot more than you'll see them to use in the Angular documentation. And that is because the Angular documentation tries to keep things simple, and it makes it a pain if you ever wanted to go through and test something. So you want basically a module for every service, controller, etc. That will save you a lot of time because you can set up config and set up teardown stuff. So we're going to declare a factory. So this is one of the ways we declare a service, and we're going to call it GitHub. Nice and simple. You put the $sign there by convention. I just always seen it there in all the documentation and all of the modules, so it's going to go there. Next, we're going to need HTTP. It's one of the services provided by Angular. And now our function. Now, if you recall, the way factories work is that they return the actual service. So we're actually just going to return it. Nice and easy. get us some space to work. And we only want one function for this example. We want events. And events is a function itself. So when we call github.events, the function, we want to get back all of the events, if that makes sense. It does. So we have our function that's going to take in a config object that's going to take our username and password. GitHub's API is very strictly rate limited if you don't have a username and password. So we're going to do that in case anything goes wrong. You don't lock yourself out. So what we need to do now is we're going to return http.get. So we're issuing a GET request to the URL that we want, which is https://api.github.com/events. And now http.get takes its own config object, which has headers. We need to pass an HTTP header. This is for authentication. So if those of you who are familiar with HTTP authentication, you can authenticate with a thing called basic authentication using an base64 encoded combination of your user and password. And that's what we're going to do. So it's called an authorization header. And we plug into it the word basic. And then we add, there's this lovely function in JavaScript called B2A, which will just encode it into base64 for us. It's great. So we say conf.user plus colon, this is the syntax, plus conf.password. And all of a sudden, this should work. So if you notice what's going on here, naturally grabbing from a URL is asynchronous. To get around this sort of problem, Angular uses a thing called promises. So the http.get is actually returning a promise, which can later be resolved to a value. It's not a value in and of itself yet. So we'll do that in the controller level later, though. So we're going to hop into our controller now, and we are going to consume GitHub API, which we declared elsewhere. That's that module with the service that we want. Now we declare GitHub as a service that we require. Angular will notice that it's there and manually call the factory function for us, generate the service lazily. It's very nice. So now we're going to put a function on scope, .load event. Events is going to be a function. The reason we're declaring it on scope is that we can attach it to the submission of the form by doing this. That way, everything's linked to a user action and not just being done willy-nilly like. So scope.load events is just going to need to take github.events, and we're going to pass in the object that takes in user scope.user. You say, where is scope.user? It'll be there. Password scope.password. Now, the way we're going to get scope.user and scope.password, we will bind them later, like the input element we saw earlier in the presentation. So this is a promise. So what we need to do is we need to resolve it now. So we say .success. It's a specific resolving function on HTTP that gives us just the data that we want. So when our request to GitHub succeeds, we're going to take the data and we're going to load it into scope.events. Angular will recognize that this has happened and update for us. It's incredibly convenient. We're also going to log the data for our own personal debugging purposes. GitHub by default will return us 30 elements if all has gone according to plan. So last thing we need to do is we need to hop into template. This template again is, remember, linked to that controller. So what we want to do is we want to consume the values in these inputs. So we say ngModel is user, and ngModel, it's not really a model, I don't know why they call it model, password. So now what happens is the value of these text inputs is constantly updated into the scope as the value of that variable. The last thing we want to do is Angular has this other directive that we're going to use called ngSubmit. What ngSubmit does is it lets you run a JavaScript expression on the submission of a form and overwrites the normal practice of form submission, so your web page won't reload. It's very nice. And this is where we do load events. So, assuming I didn't break everything, which I probably just did. There's one error, probably just, oh wait, I didn't include it. All right, so we created a new service, but the client didn't know about it. So we need to create that, we need to load that service in via script tag. So that script tag will load like so. We will call it services/GitHub API. I spelled services wrong, I gotcha. All right, now that we have that in place, I spelled API wrong, it's in caps. Preliminary debugging. All right, what's it yelling at me for? This is good to see. Okay, see, this is why you keep Angular unminified. It's giving me a full diagnosis of what went wrong. So it's because I had a typo, and it didn't compile the code right. I put a semicolon here that didn't belong in there. It's inside a JavaScript object. That's not valid syntax. I've done that every time. Okay. So now, Lord willing, we're on a load event. I want the other Chrome window. And we should see an error. GitHub is not defined. This is lovely. All right, so we defined GitHub in GitHub API. We've loaded in the GitHub API script. So we go into controller and we say, okay, are we using it? Yes, we are. Well, shoot. So debugging Angular can be absolutely awful at some points. Oh, wow, I was the easier error than the one I've run into before. Thank you, guys. I was thinking that it wasn't finding the GitHub service versus just wasn't defined. Because, you know, I'm on top of things. So we've run that. Oh, I'm sure I got an error. I didn't, is that not an error? Is there no error? There's our objects. They came in, it worked. All right. This is, thank you. Thank you. All right, so we're going to take a look at this. Angular tries to alleviate some of the debugging problems, but debugging is always awful. So this is what an object we're getting back from GitHub looks like. If you can see it up here. We have an actor which contains all the information about who's doing it, and we have a payload and all sorts of other information and a type. So I am going to not honor the payload because the payload is specific to the type, and that's a lot of types to deal with. So we're just going to basically say what the user did and display some cool information about them. So what we want to do is we're going to hop back into our template now, and now we're going to start using templating magic. Templating magic lets us do some really fun stuff, like in here, we can now say event, as we got that from ngrepeat. So we can say event.actor.avatar URL. That's the, I'm pretty sure that's the GitHub one. I'll check it in a second. And then we has done, and we want to say event.type. So what that should do, let me check that really quick about the avatar URL. That's right. All right. Only that's not the URL, it's the name. That's the login. Okay. Yes?
Don't you need to do ngrepeat over that to get it to get the for every single object?
No, see, so what's happening here is that ngrepeat is taking this entire block of code.
We already did have ngrepeat.
Yes. We were using it before. It's okay. So now what this should do is not display images, because we don't have images loading yet, but it will display who done what. So we'll load it up. Oh, oops, I have the default values in the controller that we should probably get rid of. All right. And look at that. We're now pulling information down from GitHub. Imagine just how hard this would be with using like jQuery. It would be awful. We have to compile templates and do all sorts of silliness. So now we want to grab the images for them. So what we get from GitHub is not actually their image that we want. So we actually, I know it is. So we want to grab that. So we're just going to go into index, and we're just going to say, we can't say source equals, we say ng source equals. If you do source equals, the browser will start throwing errors because it gets really confused. So that's why Angular has provided the ng source directive. So we say event.actor.avatar URL. We refresh that. And of course, we got to enter the things again. And now we have images showing up. Now, there's one last thing I want to do. I want to. Oh, I hit back. I hit back. That's my bad. It's max. You flick your finger, and suddenly everything just goes away. So there we go, it's all there. So now I want to be able to click on one of these and see the person's profile. That's all well and good, but the API does not provide me with the link to their profile. It provides me their login name. Thankfully, I know the schema on GitHub. It's pretty easy. It's GitHub/their username. So we're going to create a filter to do that, so we can kind of get around and try out new things. So we'll call this GitHub URLs.js. So we declare another module. This is starting to look pretty familiar, hopefully. GitHub URLs. And GitHub URLs is going to depend on absolutely nothing and declare only one filter. So this is a really silly module at this point, but in theory, if we needed more URLs from GitHub, we'd stuff them all in here. So we're going to declare a filter for profile page. And it's going to just take in, I spelled that wrong. Thank you, guys. It's going to take in an input. You can actually have parameters on these as well, but we don't need that right now, so we're not going to use it. And we're just going to return, I can type, I swear, github.com/+input. So now we want to use this. We want to use this filter now inside of our template. But what's really using the filter there isn't the template; it's the controller. So we need to declare GitHub URLs, in quotes, of course, because it's a string, and I can program, as a dependency. So the last thing we need to do is include it in our index.html because, again, the client doesn't know about it. Now, this, including all these scripts, looks really annoying, and it is. And if you're honestly working in a production system, you shouldn't do it. You should have a build script that would compile all of these together. Right now, we don't have that because it's a bit of overhead, and I like being able to just edit them really quick and easy. So we're just going to have GitHub URLs. I know it's in a different folder. So put it in filters. Also, the order doesn't matter. They're not compiled until they're all loaded. So that's important to note. And when you're putting in scripts, don't stress over that. And I should use it. So if we want to use it, we go into here, and we're going to change this div to an A tag. It's going to be now a link. That's what they are in HTML if you're not horribly familiar. So href is where it's going to go. And it's going to link to, check this out, event dot. Notice we can access the event inside the ngrepeat on the same element. That's because ngrepeat is applied to that element again and again and again. It's not a wrapper, so that's just important to note. GitHub event.actor.login and pipe that into, what did we call it? We called it profile page. So the last thing we need to do is, just to click the housekeeping, is that A tags aren't block level, and it will screw up our display if we don't have this. So we're just going to make it display as a block like the div was before. And then if we refresh, it got mad at me. That is awkward. So I'm going to play this easier and put it just on this span tag instead and not try to do all of my shenanigans. So we're just going to copy all this. Sometimes I feel diabolical while coding this. It's because making this change without Angular would be a pain in the butt, unless you wanted to serve it without, not on the client side. If you want to serve it on a server, that's all well and good, but that's not hipster enough. So it blew up in my face. So that means we have an error in, probably. Let's see what the issue is. See, now I'm even teaching you how to debug it, guys. It's great. Unknown provider, input provider.
Is it case sensitive? Then you capitalized an S on one of the pages I don't remember.
Oh no, that's not the problem. The filter isn't working.
Oh.
I probably used the wrong syntax to declare the filter. This is a mess. So we're going to do this a bit more hacky. And we're just going to say, I believe I can just pipe it in, But we're not going to do that because I don't want to sit here and experiment with how Angular works in front of you guys. You don't want that. I don't want that. It's all just sadness. So back here, look at that. We have a working app. I apologize for that mess. If you look into the GitHub repo, there's the actual working filter implementation. I tried to fly without the docs by my side on this one, and I didn't horribly crash and burn aside from the beginning and the end. The middle was good, though. So I guess, do you guys have any questions about Angular before I can kind of give you a little wrap up and show you some? Yes?
How well does it play with your favorite server-side technology?
Really well, sort of. So the idea is you're going to connect via HTTP, the HTTP service that we saw today, which is why we're using GitHub, just to show you could use it. There's a restriction in browsers by default from the good olden days where we all wanted to be really safe and ignore promiscuous computing, where we wanted the ability to block all scripts that aren't from the same domain. So for example, if I go to github.com and try to load a script from google.com, it would throw a fit. Now, as you might know, that's not the case anymore entirely. There are ways around it now. There's a thing called cross-origin resource sharing, which is basically a server can declare that it wants to allow that, and then that comes back in an HTTP header, and then the client's like, okay, cool, I can do that. So GitHub actually supports that, and that's part of why we're using it. I know Google supports it. Twitter supports it on some of their APIs. In other words, it's going to be hit or miss on which API you're using, whether it's going to entirely support it or not. And it's just the nature of things, sadly. Yes?
How well does Angular deal with security events? Because your name and password are inflated.
Yes. Okay. So if you'll notice, I did a terrible thing today. I used basic authentication, and you should never do that. Because what that meant is that I had to trust this website with my login credentials, which I trust myself generally, so I was okay with. But normally you use something called OAuth, which is the standard. It's like, for example, when you hit the sign in with Facebook button and a window pops up and it says, yes, I want this to have access to my Facebook. It's marginally more secure. So the GitHub 2.0 specification is actually very server-based. The idea is that you have to have a client secret, which again is a problem on JavaScript because we've built so many great tools to show you exactly what's going on at any given moment that it's really, you basically have to assume that every part of your application is compromised at any given moment. So the 3.0 spec, which has been implemented by Google on several of their APIs and in a couple other places, actually allows for ways of working with that without a client secret. It does some other fancy stuff. As well as you can do OAuth 2 with this. I know I'm giving you a way longer answer than you probably wanted, but you can also do OAuth 2 with Angular, but it involves a small server-side component to tuck a cookie into the browser, and then that way you keep your client secret on the server, tucks a cookie in, Angular's like, oh, I saw the cookie, and we can continue working. Yes?
You know how Angular compares with Knockout?
Would it be fair to say it knocks it out? Oh, thank you. Yeah, no. Angular is much more testing oriented than most of anything you're going to find out around there. So if you're looking at Knockout or Ember, which is another competitor, Angular is focused on doing everything, handling all of your business logic and presentation, everything, and allowing it to be testable via dependency injection and stuff like that. So I've worked with Knockout a bit before. It works, but obviously, but I have found my home in Angular. Oh, I know, right? Yes.
Are there any sorts of browser compatibility issues with like the custom attributes and elements COP.IE6?
Okay, so Angular has a website page on their website that tells you how to be compatible with IE 7 and up. IE 8 is supported by default, which is really nice. IE 7 does this really silly thing if you have a custom element and basically takes the contents out of the custom element and puts it alongside the rest of it. So they have this silliness that you have to do to make it not do that. Yes.
I actually wasn't ever able to get to work with IE8 just by the setting of it.
Really?
Yeah. And fine, but IE8
Strange. File a bug report. I believe the compatibility stuff is, the special stuff is 7 up. It may be 8 up. So that may actually be the case. Yes?
You had a nice directory structure in there. Is that something that you made or something that was generated?
That is something that I made. Because, oh, okay. So Angular, okay. So Angular ships with nothing. It just says, here's your JavaScript file, get cracking. They have a project called Angular Seed, which is like, this is how you get started with Angular. And it's bad. It's really bad. The way it's organized is that you have a head module and then like .controllers, .services, .directives, and it all fits under there. The problem with that is they're all implicitly depending on each other because of that. That means the services have access, the controllers have access to the services implicitly because they're both part of the same module, which is bad. Bad. Because if you want to come in and do some testing, everything's in one module and they're all related. So mocking up gets really weird. So I created that one by reading a ton of blog posts on companies that have been doing it. They say keep things oriented by functional modules and say this module is in charge of, for example, this one is just the feed. And that feed would have all of its stuff that it would need in there. Sometimes even testing. I prefer to keep the testing out, but that's just me. Yes?
What do you do with the inevitable situation when you need to use something from jQuery and you can't really set all the events?
Why would I need to use something from jQuery?
There's so much. Like if you wanted to use type head or something.
Okay, so if I want to use type head, actually Angular is compatible with jQuery, so you're actually going to be okay there. So you just won't use the onload events, but as long as you use the jQuery functions inside the Angular frame, it's fine. If I use it, it's not actually a frame, but like the framework. If I use it inside of a controller or a template or something like that, it would still work. Yes?
Is it easy to say, write an AngularJS app so it gracefully degrades the JavaScript off so that the page doesn't have like weird Angular syntax everywhere?
Yes, there is. There is. So I mentioned earlier the ability of browsers now to do a thing called push state, which is basically trick the browser and think it's navigated to a new page. So what that does is if you look at our URL, not like that, if I just loaded it up because it does funny things on form submission. If I loaded that up, see how it has that #/. So anything after the pound or hashtag is ignored. That is that's accessible via JavaScript, but not like used by the browser to route pages. There's a thing in Angular, and I can show you how it would work really quick. I'm not going to actually activate it because the server isn't set up to do it, and I'll tell you why it's important. Is you can use this thing called location provider, which is used by route provider. Look at that, all this fancy modularity coming up in here. And what you do is you just say location provider dot HTML5 mode, or HTML5 I think, true. So what happens here is that it'll handle all the routing normally without any of the hash bangifying. And then what you can do is you can then on the server, this would be really nasty, but you could do it. On the server, have it render the page in the context that you want. So basically I go to like / contacts, and the server would populate contacts for me rather than the client side, and it would have to line up. It's a pain, but you could do it. Typically, I would say that no JavaScript is not a real situation anymore, to be perfectly honest. The government would have you think otherwise, but you require JavaScript, it's part of the platform. All right, cool, thanks guys. I believe there's pizza in the back now, so enjoy, and thanks for your time.